This is Rouge Park, on the very edge of Toronto. Every day, countless hikers and joggers escape the bustle of the big city to explore these peaceful forests, winding their way through the woods on old, well-trodden paths. But most of them have no clue that these aren't all ordinary hiking trails. One of them is part of an incredible story. This trail is more than 200 years old, and it's connected to some of the most dramatic events in history, born in a time of bloody war to bring down an emperor half a world away. This is Canadiana. The Rouge Valley has been an important place since long before Toronto was founded. The first people to blaze trails through its forests were the ancestors of today's First Nations, prehistoric hunters who stalked its slopes thousands of years ago. And in the 1600s, the Seneca village of Genetset-Wayagon sat high on a hill overlooking the valley. The river below was a vital trade route, attracting famous French explorers, fur traders, and missionaries. It wasn't until the late 1700s that the British showed up. They came to build a new city along that old trade route. A tiny, muddy frontier town that would eventually grow to become the biggest metropolis in Canada. Toronto was founded in 1793, a notorious year in European history. At the same time, the British were laying out the settlement's first roads here on the shores of Lake Ontario. Far on the other side of the Atlantic, the streets of Paris were soaked in blood. The French Revolution was at its terrifying height. Liberty, equality, and fraternity had turned into tyranny, paranoia, and slaughter. And soon, France was at war. The revolutionaries who'd been guillotining aristocrats in Paris were now fighting with nearly every monarchy in Europe. And by 1796, they'd started winning their battles, thanks to a popular new general who led the French army to one victory after another. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and it seemed as if no one could beat him. Before long, he had seized power in France, crowned himself emperor, and built a network of conquests and alliances that stretched from one end of Europe to the other. By the winter of 1806, there was only one country left standing in the way. Britain was next on Napoleon's list. There was just one big, floating, wooden problem: the Royal Navy. The British fleet had ruled the waves for the last 100 years. Napoleon's fleet was no match for it. When they clashed at the Battle of Trafalgar, the French Navy was left in tatters. But Napoleon still had another way of dealing with the Royal Navy. He could take away their wood. It took thousands of trees to build a single ship, but England was running out of forests. They've been chopping them down since the Stone Age. The trees they needed to make masts for their ships were especially hard to find. They were made of big, strong, old-growth pines. The British didn't have any of those left. They shipped them in from the far side of Europe, from the towering forests on the shores of the Baltic Sea, shores that were now controlled by Napoleon. In fact, he controlled just about all of Europe, which meant he could declare an embargo. No one was allowed to trade with England. And just like that, Napoleon had robbed the Royal Navy of their Baltic masts. The future of Europe hung in the balance. Without masts, there would be no navy. And without a navy, there would be no stopping Napoleon. That's where Toronto comes in. The city was still just a tiny little frontier town surrounded by old forests, including this one. And this forest was full of masts. Now it was axe-wielding lumberjacks making trails through these woods. In fact, it was those lumberjacks who made this trail. With the British Empire at war, they came to the Rouge Valley to find the biggest and oldest white pines they could, then bring them crashing to the ground. Those huge logs were then floated down the Rouge River to Lake Ontario and shipped down the St. Lawrence to make the long journey across the Atlantic. And it wasn't just happening in Toronto. There were forests all over eastern Canada, so the lumberjacks got to work. Timber exports went up by about 1,000% in just 4 years. Tens of thousands of masts headed across the Atlantic. And Napoleon's feeble navy couldn't do anything about it. The trees chopped down in the Rouge Valley rose again as masts from the decks of British ships fighting the French half a world away. The Royal Navy was saved. Napoleon never did invade England. His embargo eventually broke down, and soon his empire crumbled. He was defeated and exiled by a coalition of European powers, and then escaped only to be defeated and exiled again, this time for good. But even with Napoleon gone, the British still wanted Canadian lumber. Trees kept coming down and exports kept going up. Soon forestry had taken over from the fur trade as the engine of the Canadian economy, and today it's still one of the country's biggest industries. There are no more lumberjacks in the Rouge Valley, though. The forests growing here today are protected. Rouge Park is now a national urban park. Here, you can still find enormous white pines towering above the forest floor. Some have been growing here since those Napoleonic days. This old logging trail is now known as the Mast Trail in memory of that time. And 21st century Torontonians and tourists can walk in the very same place those lumberjacks did as they waged their wooden war against Napoleon more than 200 years ago.
Those pine trees weren't just used to build ships in England. Before the Napoleonic Wars were over, some of the biggest warships in the world were being built in cities like Toronto and Kingston to fight bloody battles on Lake Ontario. I'll tell you all about that in a second. But first, I want to thank you so much for watching. This is the first mini-sode of our new season, though to be honest, the stories turned out to be so interesting that a lot of them aren't that mini at all. We filmed every one of them in English and in French, so you can find the link to the French version in the description below. Each one will feature a national historic site or a national park run by Parks Canada, one of our financial supporters this season. We couldn't have made this season without them, but we need your help too. If you'd like to make sure we can keep telling stories like this one, click the link to our Patreon below. Even just a wee little monthly donation goes a long way. You can also like, comment, and subscribe. Please click the bell so you get notified when a new episode comes out. And you can follow us on social media at This Is Canadiana. Now, back to those warships. Napoleon wasn't the only one with an embargo. The British had one against him, too. This meant neutral countries like the United States were caught in the middle, and the tensions that stoked soon boiled over into another war. The US declared war on Britain. And with the Brits distracted by Napoleon, the Americans seized their opportunity to invade the Canadian colonies. The War of 1812 had begun. Suddenly, the Great Lakes were a battlefield too. control of Lake Ontario became vitally important. If the Americans could take the lake, they'd be able to sail down the St. Lawrence River and attack Montreal. So, a naval arms race broke out, with both sides rushing to build the most powerful fleets they could. Those warships unleashed horrors on the waters of Lake Ontario. The battles were so gory that some crews spread sand across their decks to keep them from getting too slippery. Others painted them red so the blood would blend in. Many were killed on both sides. But the Americans never did manage to take Lake Ontario. The Canadians eventually built their most powerful ship yet. HMS St. Lawrence had more than 100 guns, a crew of 700, and was even bigger than the British flagship that had led the fleet to victory over the French at the Battle of Trafalgar. HMS St. Lawrence never had to fight a single battle. It was so overwhelmingly impressive that the Americans simply gave up trying to take the lake. I'm Adam Bunch, and we'll see you next time on Canadiana.